I'd like to bring us into focus by reading page 5 of our particular outline, the course outline, Paideia. And on page 5 is the meditation. And I would like to just refresh our inquiry, because we're beginning to move towards a new appreciation. And this meditation bears repetition at certain junctures throughout, so I'll introduce it again. When I was younger, I used to think that once you had written something, or you said something, or did something, then it was there, and it was like an accountable fact. But experience over 30 years has taught me to reintroduce basics again and again. Not only because we don't remember, but we lose perspective of how to weave some of these basics in. And so this meditation says this: no future exists without real education. Future, as an existential possibility, relies on an extended past enduring through a present order. Without an extended past, without a present order, no future exists. Even an idea like the future connotes experience and understanding woven into a transmittable continuity, which most certainly is the reality of education. Tradition does this education for man on a tribal or a familial level. Even on a national level, tradition is the way education generally works. Most curricula, more or less, reflect traditional values pumped into mere production teaching. Schools traditionally are vehicles for social continuity of its traditional values. And put in these words, a certain tautological short circuit becomes apparent at last. Tradition develops itself. Traditional values are self-interest justified by characteristic techniques of weaving the extended past into some present order so that a continued future will obtain. In this ecology of social cycle and elementary ceremony, the primary function served is continuity of interpretation. This continuity, on a natural level, is tradition. It's the mythology, or rather the very context of the mythology by which the meaning of it all is generated. But beyond this is another scale, another level. Beyond tradition, in its mythic reinforcement, is the conscious level of personality with its own historic reinforcement. The tradition of the new, the forms of things unknown, require freedom and not tradition. And so, education, on the level in which we're endeavoring here, is sensitive to an enormity of context. One might almost say the context of context itself. I once in 1970, trying to alert a very large student population at the time, somewhere around 300, up in Canada, in Calgary, I used a phrase, prepare to be prepared. Now it's very difficult for someone in a natural way to do this by themselves. There is no way that the individual can prepare to be prepared. The individual, the person who's coming out of a culture, out of a life, out of a family, out of some kind of a social situation, is unable to have this kind of perspective, preparing to be prepared, because the beginnings of such a perspective, which has to mature and grow, the very beginnings are viewed by the person as the beginnings of craziness. And when someone else exhibits the kind of omnivorous attentiveness that's characteristic of preparing to be prepared, the normal reaction of human beings is that, what an oddball. Or if they like you, what a screwball. Or if they don't like you, what an idiot. It's as simple as this. Someone who is ambidextrous is either the most prized player on the team or is rejected as being a possibility of being a team member at all. There was a time in baseball when the switch hitter was a real rarity, until the appreciation of the value of that kind of ambidextrousness was worked into a new level of the game. And almost all really great hitters now are capable in a switch hit role. We're going to look at, starting this week, starting today, for the next month, of a new pair of books, a new set of books. The two books are The Double Helix by James Watson and Patterns of Culture by Ruth Benedict. Now, The Double Helix originally came out in this edition, I think, in the early 1960s, and I'm using the Norton Critical edition of it. In order to convey the peculiarity of this story, and Watson himself was a very peculiar person. He was that kind of oddball in his time. In order to help you to appreciate the odd, errant quality of genius, we have a copy of the film made about the Double Helix, The Race for the Double Helix, with Jeff Goldblum starring as James Watson. And if you get a chance to view this, see this, it delivers in a very good way, and Goldblum is a very capable actor, of showing the errant, peculiar personality of James Watson, who could color outside the lines like a good hermetic thief, and yet not lose track of the goals which he was seeking, even though he was getting to those goals by paths that everyone else would call cheating or inappropriate behavior or whatever. I'm pairing The Double Helix with Patterns of Culture by Ruth Benedict in order to make a point. The point is this. The point is Ruth Benedict's, for Patterns of Culture is one of the great books of the 20th century. It is easily as important as Freud's interpretation of dreams, because it sets down in fine, reasoned, ordered language certain conclusions, judgments, conceptions that are indispensable to a civilization that must transcend tradition without junking it. She, in this book, takes a look at 3 different cultures: the Dobu, the Zuni, the Kwakiutl, disparately spread over the globe. And these 3 are enormously different in the way in which they look at life. She shows us here the very peculiar quality that these 3 different cultures have. And I think it's important to understand that she sets the 3 chapters that deal with these 3 cultures into a setting, just like you would set a jewel into a setting of a ring. The setting of a jewel, that portion of the ring that holds the jewel, is called a bezel. And later on in our education, we'll look at one of the great Sufi masters, Ibn al-Arabi. His book, The Bezels of Wisdom, where he shows that the settings for wisdom are actual characters. They're the human personalities of people like Abraham or Jesus or Muhammad. They are the bezels of wisdom. Ruth Benedict takes these 3 disparate cultures, one of them where the norm is suspicion of one's neighbor, and the whole culture is based upon suspicion. Accurate, justifiable, agreed upon suspicion, so that it works because everyone suspects everyone else all the time. And contrast that with 2 other cultures where it is totally different. One, the Kwakiutl, that migrated into the Vancouver Island area of the Pacific Northwest coast. And in their origins, when they were with the Salish tribal people in northern Washington state, had a very different outlook on life from the one which they acquired by moving. And in moving in, assumed some of the characteristics of the tribes from the interior of British Columbia that used to trade with the coast for fish and other goods. And because the interior tribes of British Columbia did not have any particular cultural quality, they were hodgepodges. They were on trade routes where there was so many different kinds of people, like Los Angeles. A place whose culture is non-integrable because it's not of one kind. It's a mixture, a constant stew. Just as an aside, there is no place on the planet that is more a non-integrable culture than Los Angeles. No, it's not because of all the immigrants in the last 20 years. It's not because of the incursion of tremendous growth since World War II. It's not true because of the enormous attractiveness and growth of California over the last 100 years. It has nothing to do with Europeans or European presence in Los Angeles. The primordial Indian presence in the Los Angeles area was always incredibly diverse. There were 20 different families of language in the Los Angeles area in what were essentially Neolithic times. That's more linguistic diversity than all of Europe, from Ireland to Russia. Los Angeles was always what it is. And the people who moved here acquired the nature of the place. The spirit of Los Angeles is the most diversified cultural place on the planet. There is no other place that has this diversity. And it's not because of some astrological vortex, not because of little green guys beaming down energy. It is the Neolithic character of the place, the spirit of the place, is that culture cannot be integrated in Los Angeles. It's not a new Ellis Island. It's much deeper than that. It's the only place on the planet that no cultural tradition can obtain a foothold and maintain itself. They all dissolve here. All of them. And the only possibility for social order in Los Angeles is for a planetary civilization. And that has been the case since human beings have inhabited this area for the last 20,000 years. That's why this education is being offered here. And the speaker in this chair doesn't move to some comfortable place like, God forbid, Sedona. Or the devil forbid, Aspen. Or numerous other destinations on airline tickets of interest. The point that Ruth Benedict, I think you ought to see what she looked like. She was an extremely talented, gorgeous woman, a fantastic individual. This is the cover of the biography of Ruth Benedict by Margaret Mead, published by Columbia University Press. Ruth Benedict was an extraordinary woman. She did her field work as a young anthropologist with the Zuni Indians in New Mexico. The Zuni live in a very interesting urban structure called Acoma, Sky City. And the Zuni are Pueblo people. Because of the 1960s ethos, everyone's familiar with the Hopis, who were a Pueblo people. But the Zuni were more civilized than the Hopis. It sounds like heresy to those 60s holders honors who still pride themselves on being fashionably Paleolithic. The Zuni were extraordinarily refined. And Ruth Benedict was the first real person from outside of the Zuni tribe to really get a quality of feel for the reality of what was happening. Now, there were people like Frank Cushing who went to the Zuni ahead of her and collected ethnology reports, but they did not understand what they were seeing and doing. In fact, the reason that she went there was that a lot of anthropological collections had been made out of the Pueblo peoples, the Zuni peoples. The museums were full of stuff, full of things. But her teacher, who was the greatest revolutionary in the field of anthropology, his name was Franz Boas. Franz Boas. Her teacher, and in a way Franz Boas was like Louis Leakey. His best students were always women. Margaret Mead was a student of Franz Boas. Ruth Benedict was a student of Franz Boas. And I could name a half a dozen other women, great anthropologists who were all students of Franz Boas, because they understood something of what he was saying, that it was very difficult for men, scientific men, before the 1920s to hear. The women could hear it, the men couldn't hear it so good. Not so well, but so good. They heard it, but they didn't believe it. What did he say? He said, you cannot yank things out of their context and put them like pastiche collectibles in museums, and from that draw conclusions about the nature of man anthropologically. There were international raconteurs who were trying to do imitations of Sir James George Frazer, of writing huge tomes with quotations from everywhere and examples from everywhere and making great generalizations about human nature, and none of it was other than fictiveness. Boas told his students, the only way to understand another people is to go and live with them. Not just walk a mile in their moccasins, but learn to live as they live life. And Ruth Benedict did this with a Zuni. And when she achieved this, when this beautiful, sophisticated New Yorker woman achieved this, she realized that she was as human in a Zuni culture as she was as a New York anthropologist, able to put on jewelry and heels and knock out a room. And so she got intensely curious about getting oneself into several different cultural modes, and what then would man look like if you were at home in, let's say, 3 or 4 different cultures, not just 2. With 2, you get a comparison. But it's kind of like a tear and compare. But with 3 or 4 or more, you can't do much tearing. You have to start doing relationalities. And so she took the primordial 3, because once you have a 3 quality, you can't just say A does this, but B does that. You can't have that polarized either-or quality. You have to start building structural relationalities, which means that thought then has to enter into a new power, a new quality, the quality of symbolizing, which means that language has to transcend its mythic horizon, where it grew and was comfortable and had lay since the origins of language. It meant that one had to learn to think interiorly rather than just think in response to exterior events. And Ruth Benedict is one of the really great minds of the 20th century. She was able to do this. And her book, Patterns of Culture, is the recording of her genius. Yes, she wrote other books, but it's this book, which came out in 1933, that completely devastated a realm of assumptions that was debilitating. Debilitating not only the arrogant, prideful, largely European people who were scoffing at these primitive people who didn't know any better, leading dirty, filthy lives. Why don't they improve themselves? Look at them, for God's sake. But debilitating those very native peoples because they felt insane of trying to hold on to values that obviously didn't fit in any other kind of a world. And it was Ruth Benedict's book that was the first sane note in this cacophony of degradation. It is more of a revolution, more of an enduring revolution than all of the forced gulag reforms of Joseph Stalin, which have turned out to be a handful of shards of nonsense. We'll see a little later in the course, when we get to symbols and we get to Suzanne Langer, another American woman whose incredible, heartful, precise intelligence performed a similar service for philosophy as Ruth Benedict did for anthropology. Yes, Margaret Mead is the more famous of all the female anthropologists, students of Franz Boas, but it's Ruth Benedict who is the ace. She is the one, and Patterns of Culture is her book that makes beautifully a point that must never be lost. Now, Boas himself is an interesting character. Here is a book of essays on the centennial of the birth of Franz Boas. Boas was a European, he was a German, and when he came over to the United States, he recognized that there was an undone project, a project that had been initially thought of by Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson had begun to have made up dictionaries translating American Indian languages into vocabularies of English. And when Jefferson retired from the presidency, that was going to be one of his great works. His great life work was to put together a compendia of the different languages of the American Indian vis-a-vis a common denominator of English, to try to understand the real nature of man outside of a large but limited European experience, so that the political forms of American democracy would be primordial and not limited to a bias of European descent. Respect European descent as Jefferson did, and very few people knew it well enough to respect it as much as he did. He saw that in the future, in this country, it had to be of human nature and not of any particular stylized culture. He was unable to do this because the trunk carrying those was lost on the way back from the White House to Monticello. It was never found. He was unable to pursue that. Boas picked up the trail. And it was because of Boas that the study of American Indian languages really began to take hold. And next week I'll draw out the 2 big fat volumes published by the United States government, the Bureau of American Indian Ethnology. Great big huge tomes about the languages of the American Indian peoples. And when those 2 volumes came out before the turn of the century, they formed the bedrock base upon which the science of linguistics was founded. And all of this development in language, which led to the corollary developments in logic, which make computers, for instance, available, are all due to this seed. Because if you don't know what you're talking about when you talk, there's no way that you can structure it. Especially structure it so that it can express something new. Boas, in order to understand this, in the most incredible synchronistic sort of a way, did his field work with the Kwakiutl Indians of Vancouver Island, which turns out were the very best example that God himself could have chosen to show someone that there's no chance to have an integral culture if there's not some synthesizing orientation to allow for the integration to come together, which the Kwakiutl culture strove more than any other culture to have. And out of many monographs, this is the most important, Kwakiutl Culture by Franz Boas. And it was finally published and brought out in 1935, 2 years after Patterns of Culture, because Patterns of Culture set the world on its ear. The book was a bestseller. It sold hundreds of thousands of copies, and in the 1930s, one of its great readers was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The same Roosevelt who wrote a very interesting book review. You didn't know that American presidents sometimes were very intelligent, very, very literate, not just members of Phi Beta Kappa societies, but incredibly intelligent men and women. We need a woman in the White House so we can keep that qualification viable. Roosevelt wrote a review of a book called Jefferson and Hamilton about the struggle between two ways of looking at the United States. And at the end of his review, FDR was still a young man. This was in the late 20s. He still hadn't conceived of being president, but he had conceived that something essential needed to be matured in American life and set free to work. And at the end of his review of the book Jefferson and Hamilton, he asked the question. He said, "We seem to be surrounded by a lot of protégés of Alexander Hamilton today. Is there a Jefferson out there?" And to answer his own question, his political crony buddy, Louis Howe, was that his name? Whispered to him, he said, "You're the one. If you can see it, then it's up to you to do it." He was the Jefferson out there. Patterns of Culture came out in 1933, at the very time that FDR was sworn in. So that the whole churning of American life about this time of year in 1933, the whole churning of American life suddenly had a new beginning. Not so that everyone could see that this was a beginning, but there were a couple of things happening. FDR became president, and Ruth Benedict's Patterns of Culture was published, and Adolf Hitler came to power in Germany, all at the same time. When you look for the synchronicities in history, you see the choreography of an enormous drama. Neither a comedy nor a tragedy, but a mystery. It's up to us to try to appreciate a little bit of the context and not just think, oh, well, geez, it's like a textbook. Geez, we have to read something? The phrase in the 1950s was, come on. Now, the three chapters in here that deal with these three different kinds of peoples, different outlooks, the Zuni, the Dobu, the Kwakiutl, there's no way that we can have any understanding without having read these three chapters, and there's no way that any of you has the time to read these three chapters. There's no way. So we're going to do it a different way. We're going to do it in a way in which I used to teach 30 years ago in San Francisco. We're going to put all our names on pieces of paper and throw them in a hat. And we're going to pull them out of the hat and put them into three different piles. In the first pile, you people have to get together and read the chapter on the Zuni, or portion it out among yourselves and find some way in 5 minutes to tell the rest of us what the hell that was about so we don't have to do it. And the second pile will be for the Dobu, and the third pile will be for the Kwakiutl. So we get these three chapters which are essential. We cannot go on without them. They have to be done. The only alternative is that all of you sign an agreement, an oath, that you will all read all three by next week. No signers. I thought so. Trust me. So during the break, we're going to put our names on little slips of paper, and just by sheer chance, you're going to be put into questing groups with other people who are there by sheer chance. They didn't choose you. They don't like it any better than you. And I'm not responsible because it's the laws of chance, right? Except that maybe in terms of the education, you'll see that there's a synchronicity operating here. And we'll see how it happens. Now, what I'm going to try to do is to take the chapters before and after, starting with the chapters after, and beginning this week with chapters 7 and 8, just to start to cue us in on this material. And next week, and the following week, and the week after, we'll have these three chapters at the end of the first part of the lecture, just before the break, I'll step aside and the three groups in their order for just 5 minutes each. We'll take 15 minutes and we'll digest all of this. So make it short and sweet. Now the purpose of this is also ulterior. Whenever there is a powerful ideational surge, our temperament, because of the society that we live in, because of the culture that we live in, the experience of new powerful ideas translates into egotistical power. And if the person themselves does not experience it, they project it onto the teacher. Oh, what a fantastic teacher! And this is unnecessary as much as wrong. And so we need to get used to the fact that at certain junctures, I always will vacate this seat, not out of not caring for you, but out of caring for you. Whenever there is an opportunity for some projective authority to be established, I will, as consistently as possible, not be here so that there'll be an empty chair and you yourselves occupy it. That's why throughout this educational cycle, when you deliver your projects, like you delivered your walks, and later on you're going to deliver your masks, and many other beautiful, wondrous things, I won't be here. Not because I don't care and I'm not interested. Be back in the back room making tapes, doing something else, whatever. To forestall this kind of pseudo-authoritarianism until you get used to the fact that I can be here or not be here at moments of your juncture, so that the reality of your community is with the community and not with some leader. That is the essential taste of democracy. And without that taste, and it's an acquired taste, without that taste, there's no way that the United States can work or be an example even to its own people, much less the needed example that it must be for the planet as a whole. Because it's only a truly democratic, spiritually democratic community that is able to transcend tradition and make the higher powers of integration that are necessary to deal with problems of history. And the problems of persons, and the problems of science, as well as the problems of art, all have to do with these higher orders that are beyond tradition. There never was, in any tribe, a Rembrandt. And in order to get to those higher powers, because the universe has a right to have Rembrandts, we have to rise to the level of civilization. Now, this does not mean throwing cultures away at all. It doesn't mean not preserving traditions at all. In fact, it means preserving them. It means honoring them. But it means also opening up further possibilities that would never have been discoverable before. There's nothing wrong with Gregorian chant. It's beautiful. It has its own qualities. But there's no way at all that monks who were familiar with Gregorian chant in the 10th century could have heard a sonata by Mozart. They could not have heard it. Because those realms of human feeling were opened up by people like Bach and Haydn, and without them, there would have been no Mozart. And a world without Mozart is an impoverished world. I'm using that as an example, but you get the point. So this kind of activity that we're doing is not just a make-work, regressive going back to college day activity. This is very high level kinematics dealing with essential realities that we are all interested in. and need not so much to master, but to be able to participate wholly in them. Moses was unable to be heard. He told the congregation, he said, "No man has ever beheld the face of God." And in an esoteric way, what he was saying, that only the community as a whole is the kind of mirror within which one could see the face of God. It is the community that mirrors the face of God, not the leader, not the prophet. And in order to emphasize it, Moses never went to the promised land, but the community did, and they throve, or thrived, I forget which. Let me review, just before the break, one other aspect here. There's a synchronicity going on here, a weaving of men and women in anthropology. Early anthropology was made in the United States. Boas, Margaret Mead, Ruth Benedict, innumerable others. But curiously enough, one of Margaret Mead's early boyfriends, Rio Fortune, and Ruth Benedict cites him in Patterns of Culture again and again because he's the only person who ever understood the Dobu. And his book, Sorcerers of Dobu, The Social Anthropology of the Dobu Islanders of the Western Pacific, is one of the great single works in anthropology. And Sorcerers of Dobu is the single source for the Dobu section. So those names that come out of the hat that get the Dobu, you'll want to look at R.F. Fortune, Rio, R-E-O. It's a great name, right? Rio Fortune. The introduction is by a man named Melanowski. Can you imagine? My God, it's published in London in 1932. It came out just a few months before Patterns of Culture. Well, do you think they planned that? Well, and dedicated to Margaret Mead. Holy cow, Batman. Let's take a break. So we're coming back to the new pair of books. We're talking about Patterns of Culture, Ruth Benedict, and soon to fold in the Double Helix. In the introduction to Patterns of Culture, Franz Boas pointed out that a new interpretation needed to be had of culture, that anthropology needed to come into a mature understanding of cultural form, and that pursuant to this particular task, we had to learn to back away from collections of stuff that were ripped out of context, and to have researchers who would go into the context and learn to live in that way, and thus the understanding would come of reconstructing, these are his words, reconstructing historical connections, and now my words, rather than piecemeal artifact bits. Reconstructing historical connections. Now, this is very important. There is really no history in cultures. There's tradition, there's legend, there's even myth, but there's no history. So that the historical connections that Franz Boas is talking about here is not accessible consciously to these people. It's like this. The same technique that Franz Boas encouraged people like Margaret Mead and Ruth Benedict to do in the 1920s, Louis Leakey encouraged among his proteges, largely women also, like Jane Goodall, and some of the other ladies who went to study the great apes. The gorillas, the chimpanzees, Dian Fossey with the gorillas, Jane Goodall with the chimpanzees, many, I think 3 or 4 other women with different other primate groups of the great apes. Jane Goodall spent somewhere around 25, 30 years with the chimpanzees of Gombe. They went to learn how they lived, and they built historical connections that no one had ever seen before. And for instance, Jane Goodall brought out the fact that there were family relations that built traditionally, and characteristics that carried in the individuals of these chimpanzees for many generations, and that, lo and behold, there were certain irreparable junctures that occurred where there was open warfare among the chimpanzees due to sociological schisms. Not that the chimpanzees knew that there were, but that because Jane Goodall had lived as they had lived and followed them for decades, understood the connections, and made the point, which we today, is a piece of dust, I'm not blowing the point away, made the connections whereby we can understand now, on a very sure footing, some of the most bedeviling problems that have plagued man for the last 6,000 years. The problems are not due to the fact that those people are inferior to these people, that their religion is no damn good while ours is really special, that all of these kinds of rationalizations are so many band-aids and just so much watered down cranberry juice parading as methylate, and none of it goes to the healing process of what actually is the problem. And that the sociological problems with higher ordered living beings are something that can be understood consciously and resolved to the point of cure. Not compromise, not patchwork, but cure. And just like the promise of the Genetic Genome Project is to find ways to repair what seem to be mysterious and irreparable diseases, to repair them so that they never occur again, to take them out of human history once and for all, by the little process of weeding the genome and getting rid of the weeds that have grown in the meantime. The same thing in terms of societies. Not to mulch everyone up into a Fourth Reich automaton state, but to really have a mature human civilization where there is an unlimited range of cultural values that are experientiable, livable, respectful, endurable, at the same time as a unified civilization, not one of authoritarian or totalitarian basis, but on one based on freedom. This is the promise. This is a guaranteed promise from the 21st century. It'll take all of that, probably a good deal of the 22nd, to finally affect that. But it's a written promise that can be given now. But we can't get there. We can't participate in that unless there's some kind of an educational basis upon which the water can be run clear. Because the waters are so muddied now in terms of prejudice, in terms of hates, in terms of ingrown violence, that there's no way that anyone can go further. Los Angeles is the perfect junkyard endpoint of the end of all cultures and the impossibility of a civilization. And so it rightfully is the first place that needs to be transformed, and to show that if it can work here, it can work anywhere at all. And so this education is developed here in Los Angeles in response to the actual chronic disease conditions. If a doctor is to be a doctor, he has to go where the disease is. And so if you're a doctor of civilization, you have to come to Los Angeles at the end of the 20th century. Even if you were some kind of supersonic, silvered, metallic UFO hotshot, that wouldn't change the fact and the conditions. And the fact that they're not here working shows that if there are such, they're not very smart. Because this is the only reality that there is. This is where we either tie a bow or tie a knot. And that's a hangman's noose at the end of that knot. So the invitation and the promise are also out to the UFOologists and their constituencies. Take a seat. There's a lot of work to be done. Now, it's somewhat of a Hollywood spin and perhaps a little glib, but you have to make it permanent and memorable. And so there's a little surrealistic edge to it. All of this is in keeping with the point made in Patterns of Culture by Ruth Benedict. It's just as if aliens who knew nothing about the reality of the place had tried to manipulate the scene. Anthropologists before this book were used to characterizing savage people by excerpting certain items from them, cataloging them meticulously, putting them into university collections, selling them off to private collectors, selling those to museum collectors. And after a cursory look with tinted glasses made in other climates, in other ways of life, saying these people don't look too good. It's rather the outlook that Charles Darwin had. The primitive peoples of South America terrified him. And he was deathly afraid of the dark, vicious, dirty origins of man. And with his country, English, Victorian, prejudicial feeling tones, inculcated several generations of people who looked upon the wogs of the world as needing to be organized into labor gangs for their benefit. Not for the wogs' benefit, but for those who were organizing them. Whereas someone like Alfred Russel Wallace, when he went up the Rio Negro River into the Amazon forest, had a beatific vision of the gorgeous golden origins of man when he saw the naked native Indian children swimming in the waters. He realized that the exposure to openness and fresh air and the adventure of life was probably characteristic of early man, and not at all the same outlook that Darwin had. And had Russel Wallace published his book before Darwin, probably there would not have been so many mistakes made in the assumptions about what is primitive, what is dirty, what is unacceptable in human nature. More than a century later, these conditions still bedevil and hound us. It cannot go on this way, not even to the end of this decade. It's already come to a crashing end. There's no way. So Ruth Benedict's Patterns of Culture, that appeared 60 years ago, is a focal point. And the three different cultures that she discusses became a kind of a touchstone for intelligence to begin to think about the varieties of the way in which human beings are human. One of the books that came out later, a generation later, by Jean Lisitsky, became very famous, was called Four Ways of Being Human. That took 4 different civilizations. Not civilizations, but cultures. But it's Patterns of Culture by Ruth Benedict that is the great study. And she deserves a place in human history rather on the same level as Sigmund Freud. He's a very great person. As long as there was no development of historical connections, one then had bits and pieces that could be mechanically distributed and reassembled according to pet peeves and theories of so-called experts. But when you go and live with the people and you get the historical cultures in their ensemble connection, then one begins to understand that this is a way of being human. And a possibility comparatively arises for the first time seriously. The possibility is this, that there is, in the spectrum of human nature, independent developments of analogous features. Independent developments of analogous features. That geographically disparate groups who never had any contact, at certain stages of a overall pattern of development, go through similar challenges and come up with remarkably analogous responses, and thus give us for the first time a realistic look that there are specific phases of maturation characteristic of entities, beings, who must integrate character and the attendant integration of culture as communities of that character, and go through a radical transformation where there must be a reversal of the energies towards differentiation, and that in the reversed differentiation, the character that appears in the integral mode undergoes a completely different quality in differentiation, and what was character in culture becomes personal consciousness in history. And that this is a very great mystery, and perhaps the greatest mystery in terms of our human experience. And it turns out from a very informed and sophisticated, mature appreciation of the veritable mystery of ourselves, that something like the book of Job becomes enormously instructive as to the precariousness of not understanding what's at stake. As long as Job was assessed and assessed himself in terms of the traditional characteristics appropriate to his culture, his character faced an insoluble and insurmountable tragedy, and he suffered for it. But when he underwent a transformation in that suffering and achieved a personal consciousness differentially able to hold itself in relationality to a vanquished character out of a completely buffaloed, I have to use the American word for it, a buffaloed culture, a culture that could not understand why would this happen? Why would an omnipotent God create evil? Literally, what in the hell for? In terms of culture, that is insoluble, and was for Job, as a character in that culture, insoluble. Only in the differential personal consciousness of history was the cure for that suffering to be had through the development of a new kind of eye. And once seen, Job repents in dust and ashes. Not in capitulation, as some stomped on, vanquished character whose culture has completely let him down on a crucial issue, but as someone who transformed and brought that whole cultural ethos into a new historical perspective, from which a new maturity could flower out of the old death. And the Hellenistic Judaism of Job's time, the 2nd century BCE, has a capacity to live historically and to have personal character, which was impossible heretofore. This is the quality of transformation that Patterns of Culture brings into play in the first third of the 20th century. It is possible to have a complex human personality able to appreciate many different ways of being human in the same person. That one is not being fragmented, one is not on the way to going crazy, one is not some kind of third-rate buffoon if you're able to live in a multiplicity of cultural ways as a single person. This is the key to that personality that can master the problems of history and master the greatest of all the challenges facing the 21st century at its beginning. How is there to be a planetary culture without erasing and effacing all of the values of human cultures that have brought people this far thus? Are there to be no more Eskimos? Are there to be no more Dobuans? Are there to be no more Pueblos? No more Jews? Are all the different cultures to be erased and effaced? This is unacceptable. But the necessity for a planetary culture is inescapable. It's not only an idea whose time has come, it's an existence quality that cannot be sidestepped. This is one of the keys. This book by this woman is one of the keys to appreciating the true dimensions of the problem and to realize the work that has to be done to get the cure, the solution, effective. Because one of the ideas that comes out of Ruth Benedict's Patterns of Culture is that we have to have the stamina, the endurance to carry a certain quality all the way through to the point of completion. If we don't, it's going to be much easier for it to regress and to be lost, to be perverted and misused in partiality. And it's much worse to be half-educated than to be not educated at all. A little learning is a dangerous thing. And she makes the point again and again. She says, facile generalizations about the integration of culture are dangerous. And they're downright perilous. And the halls of universities, the pages of popularizations, the glib pastiche so-called minds of millions would be embarrassed to find how completely close to perilous disaster they are from thinking that they know what they're doing, what they're talking about, who they are, when they're playing Russian roulette with death masks. She also writes, the relation of cultural integration to studies of Western civilization and hence to sociological theory is most easily misunderstood. Her dedication, one must be faithfully objective and in anthropological investigation come to belong to the culture that one is studying, to participate as a participant in that culture. Now, this happened to Ruth Benedict by genius, by inspiration. Franz Boas really got her juices going. He said, this needs to be done, and no one has really done this well. The field is wide open. You're young and energetic. You have the capacity intellectually. You have the character as a person. You have the dignity as a woman. I can't walk through the door for you and go down there, but you can. And she did. Some came to it by accident, like Malinowski, the man who did the foreword to Patterns of Culture. Not to Patterns of Culture, but to the Sorcerers of Dobu here. One reason that Malinowski could write the preface to Sorcerers of Dobu, he was investigating in the Solomon Islands, north of New Guinea, Polish, German, and World War I broke out, and he was stuck. He couldn't get off the islands. And he was forced to live with the Solomon Islanders for 4 years, non-stop. No relief. And in those 4 years, he came to understand that his previous anthropological work, universally respected in the universities, was junk. He hadn't seen anything. He hadn't understood what really was there. And when he was able to modulate his existence with their existence, he came to understand that the key to them was not the museum artifacts and monographs about them, but the yam gardens and so forth that they were tilling all the time with meticulous little attention to things like the soil and the seeds and coveting and protecting. And when Malinowski wrote Coral Gardens and Their Magic, it was a scale of revelation that yet today, 1994, very few people have really understood. Instead of looking at your UFO, Kabbalistic, futuristic, novelistic stuff, the magic language that Malinowski learned to speak with the Solomon Islanders about their gardens contains the very essence about the transformation that's needed for consciousness to become real. Very few people read it, very few people understood it. One of them was Ernst Cassirer, who wrote a little book called Language and Myth, which we'll use later on. He heard Malinowski when Malinowski said, God's honor. I didn't understand, but I do now. I myself have tended one of those gardens successfully. And without the magic, the stuff is not going to grow. It's not a question of irrigation. It's a question of getting the language right so that the reality is sealed so that they can grow. It's this kind of accidental quality that is very interesting with the Malinowski, but with the Ruth Benedict, she consciously went down and pioneered this. She was not exiled to the Zuni. She went by choice, and she offered herself on the altar of truthful experience, and she was accepted. Now she has in here, and I come to page 226, a couple of paragraphs. I like to just acquaint you with her language style. So if you permit me, read you a couple of paragraphs of Ruth Benedict, The Nature of Society, Chapter 7, Patterns of Culture, 1933. An intimate and understanding study of a genuinely disoriented culture would be of extraordinary interest. Probably the nature of the specific conflicts or of the facile hospitality to new influences would prove more important than any blanket characterization of lack of integration. But what such characterizations would be, we cannot guess. Probably even in the most disoriented cultures, it would be necessary to take account of accommodations that tend to rule out disharmonious elements and establish selected elements more securely. The process might even be the more apparent for the diversity of material upon which it operated. Some of the best available examples of the conflict of disharmonious elements are from the past history of tribes that have achieved integration. The Kwakiutl have not always boasted the consistent civilization which we have described. Before they settled on the coast and on Vancouver Island, they shared in general the culture of the Salish people to the south, Puget Sound. They still keep myths and village organization and relationship terminology, kinship, that link them with these people. But the Salish tribes are individualists. Hereditary privileges are at a minimum. Every man has, according to his ability, practically the same opportunity as every other man. His importance depends upon his skill in hunting, or his luck in gambling, or his success in manipulating his supernatural claims as a doctor or diviner. Notice the curious tripartite masculine ways to success. You can hunt or fish your way to success. You can gamble your way to success. You can, with magic, get others to understand and believe that you are key to their success. Very interesting. She writes, there could hardly be a greater contrast with the social order of the Northwest Coast. Even this extreme contrast, however, did not militate against Kwakiutl acceptance of an alien pattern. When they moved into Vancouver Island, they came into a new ethos, and they had to find a way of dealing with it. The Indians north of Vancouver Island, here's the British Columbian coast of Canada, here's Vancouver Island down here, very large, and above that are the Queen Charlotte Islands, where the Haida Indians, and above them the Tsimshian Indians and much more northern islands. The Kwakiutl, moving from the Puget Sound area into Vancouver Island, came into a totally different kind of quality of life. For instance, the Salish Indians went fishing with bone hooks and little spears. But when they got into Vancouver Island, the first Indian peoples that they came into contact with was the Nootka, And the Nootka, when they went fishing for whales. They didn't go fishing for little tiny fish along the shoreline. They went out in huge canoes that were carved with deep mythic images of their oceanic courage to go out with bone harpoons and kill whales. And so the Kwakiutl right away, when they talked about the manliness of going fishing, and they showed the little tiny spears and the little fish, the Nootka Indians said, the babies fish like that. Come on with us, we'll show you how men fish. And when they would get 4 or 5 days out of sight of land, the early Kwakiutl got that kind of jitteriness that you get when you're not used to the ocean. Geez, there's no land around. It's rather large. Yeah, wait till you see who lives here, the Nootkas would say. Holy Moby Dick back then. So they had to make adjustments. They had to adjust, right, the concept of what manliness was. And in making all these kinds of adjustments, the Kwakiutl came into understanding that they had to review progressively all of the baggage that they were carrying in terms of comfortable, secure culture and make modifications. So that Kwakiutl culture turns out to be a very interesting case. That's why a man like Franz Boas went exactly there and did some work and was able to say to Margaret Mead, take my work as one example, go down and do the Zuni as another example, and the boyfriend of Miss Mead, Margaret, has got a very interesting example, and see what happens when you put them together, like the students will do next week. Be interesting to see. Why? Because this juxtaposition of these 3 particular elements reveal a relationality that just sings out lessons about man that we would never have known otherwise. These are 3 exactly beautiful examples that when you put them together, you get the magic little explosion and the puff of pink smoke, and lo and behold, there's something there in the crucible. Realizations that no one really consciously was able to pin down before. It's true that someone like the teacher of righteousness who wrote the book of Job down in Qumran about 2150 years ago, that he had those insights, but he struggled mightily to try and understand what this meant. And his record of that was the Thanksgiving Psalms that appear in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Saying what Shelley said 2,000 years later. Lord, I am not sure just who you are, but when I feel the full force of your wind blowing through me, I can only make of myself a sail for your purpose. What else can I do? Where the maturity, the development of someone like Ruth Benedict of showing this, shows that we can not only endure through magisterial, mystic acceptance, but that we can learn to make these forms of realization for ourselves as tools in order to go forward to realms of human activity that were never even imaginable before. Like realms of feeling explored by Mozart, that Gregorian chant level feeling tones would be like Martian music to them. They wouldn't even know what it was. They would not have been able to hear it. Like some of Stravinsky's music that a couple of generations ago could not be heard. When The Rite of Spring was produced in Paris, they threw vegetables and shoes and everything. This is not music. Ah, but it is. It pushes the outside of that envelope chases that blue demon in the sky so that musical feeling can go Mach 3 or 4. In areas where there were suspected to be limitations, all of a sudden, not only are they opaque, but they're transparent, they're wide open, and human possibility seems extraordinarily large. So that when you get to the end of the 20th century, music has incredible adventures just waiting to be explored. There are more musical scales available in 1994 than somebody in 1894 would have even thought possible. And I'm not talking about second-raters, I'm talking about somebody like a Brahms. A 1994 Brahms is hard at work with his cigars and black coffee, exploring realms that one could never have even believed existed and yet are real. And to be petty and throw vegetables and shoes at somebody who's exploring something is the worst kind of idiocy. It's unnecessary. She writes, even this extreme contrast, however, did not militate against quachyudal acceptance of the alien pattern. They came to regard as private property, even names, myths, house posts, guardian spirits, and the right to be initiated into certain societies. These were private property. This made a huge change in the culture. If you want to have access to this guardian spirit, you have to address the owner of that as if it were private property. If that's true, then the whole ceremony of a potlatch of giving away private property assumes a tremendous sacred tone that isn't just anthropologically interesting, but is significant for understanding how human existence is founded upon reciprocity. And that money is not just some medium of exchange at all, but money is a mysterious vehicle. That has sociological principles, universal laws which are applicable and have nothing to do at all with theories about economics, which second-raters have. And that somebody already 200 years ago, like Jeremy Bentham, who investigated the reality of economic value and money, came to understand that in order to understand that, you had to understand the human mental capacity wrapped up in what is called in philosophic history his theory of fictions. And if you don't understand Bentham's theory of fictions, you will never get the point of the tremendous intellectual courage of a David Ricardo looking at economics as a perspective, a universal perspective of human endeavor having to do with the rituals of confirming existence. It's a whole different world when you understand what's going on and what has gone on. This is part of the extended past. Do you think anyone's going to take one step really into a future without knowing that? These people already outclass 99% of the people who are doing things, who are just playing with the toys that other people have made and long since gone. She writes, but the adjustment that was necessary is still apparent in the institutions of the quachyudal. The institutions record the adjustment. So that one has to understand the cultural institutions is like the ratchets recording confrontations which were essential to existence And as we'll see in ritual, this is the first level of the objective for human beings. Nature is not objective. That is a complete psychological projection to think that nature is objective. But ritual is objective. The actions we do are the first level of the real. And one becomes extremely judicious about doing anything at all when that awareness is around you, and to make sure that you do these rituals right. Because without doing these rituals right, it isn't a question that some variant and approximation of the action occurs, but no reality occurs. And if you get variations and approximations all the time, but no reality, you're living in a phantasmagoria and not life. And a lot of this has to do with phantasms, not with life. Some of these problems become so crucial one could not even tell someone who is not educated the perilousness of the situation. It's not just the blind leading the blind. It's the mad leading the sleepers to the brink. She points out that there is, in the institutions of the Kwakiutl, as in the Dobu, as in the Zuni, as in every other culture, the recording, like the rings of a tree, the recording of the stages of growth, even though they do not look upon them as stages of growth, as historical phases, we can understand that this was a historical unfolding and a growth, and we can understand and learn and bring data and meaning and interpretation and value where there was none before. We can profit by their experience in ways that they would never have imagined. They can live by that experience. We can live by the increased capacity to pull new information out of that same experience. It would be stupid to throw cultures away. We need them. But we don't need to be buried in that soil. That's the difference. It's a book like Patterns of Culture that made that available consciously for, I would say, at least hundreds of thousands, if not several millions, at the beginning of the 1930s. Just in time to counter one of the most vicious, regressive cultures of all time, National Socialist Germany. She makes the point that when we do not understand the integrative quality of culture, that it energizes itself around a dynamic, and that the dynamic, the final thing for which they strove in their religious ceremonies, was ecstasy. And she defines ecstasy as a rapt state of existence. It took a woman to say it. Where does this lead? What's the point of all of this? When all of the vectors of these institutions come together, what is the final point towards which this flows? Achieving the state of ecstasy, a rapt state of existence where one is with great total certainty included in what is real. When one understands this, the academic anthropological studies about artifacts and bits and guesses is worse than meaningless. It is perilously derisive and leads us down the wrong path completely. In mathematical terms, it leads us to believing in what we could characterize as incommensurate structures. That is a perfect definition of insanity. Believing in incommensurates and trying to force others to act as if that were true. That's the whole point of the Nazi ideology, for instance. Its evilness is not because they were stupid and bad and mean, but because they insisted that you must believe that this is true. And instead of achieving an ecstasy of life, one achieves only an ecstasy of death. I had a friend who did the horoscopes of 240 Nazis, the top, the echelon. And over and over and over again, like a death knell, it came out again and again and again. All of the horoscopes, all 240, were severely flawed in exactly the same way. Two roads. One leads to life, the other leads to death. Choose life. This is what this woman said to us 60 years ago. And many of us have profited and learned by it. And a few have carried it into a promise. More next week. Please read your sections, which means you have to find copies of the book, right? And get together with each other. Cooperate. Search and cooperate. That's the name of this week's assignment.